Good morning.
Good morning.
I am so glad you found this place. If you had come from Lakeland, you would have thought it had disappeared. The fog was terrible. Let me begin this way. These are words you may recognize. In the world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, be not like dumb, driven cattle. Be a hero in the strife. At least one of you was smiling on that. That's great. All of us have our heroes. And the author of those verses, Unitarian Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, is one of mine. Now, if you were to ask me why I would say that, I would tell you that it is because he was a brilliant person. He was someone who knew how to use language to instruct the mind and to inspire the heart. Another one of my heroes is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He was and he is an enormously controversial figure. Loved by many, but also hated by many still. Not only during his life, but even to the very present day. Why then, you might ask, would I hold him in such high regard? Well, there turn out to be several reasons. He was, for one thing, a brilliant scholar. He possessed the arcane knowledge and understood the rarefied vocabulary of technical theology and of philosophy, so seldom seen outside of academia. He was also a supremely eloquent public speaker, whose oratorical skills were beautiful to behold. I got to hear him in person, and I was amazed. He was an inspirational prophet of social justice who successfully led a decade-long struggle to achieve civil rights for Americans of all races. But he was also one thing more, and it is that thing which, above all else, has earned him a place among my personal heroes. He was a man of peace. And that, my friends, is harder than becoming learned. It is more difficult than being eloquent, and it is much greater than being able to rouse a crowd to excitement, or to endorse a policy of nonviolence in a world which loves and embraces its opposite is nothing less than committing oneself to the very awesome task, the painful task, of seeking the moral high ground when all those around you rest satisfied down below in the valley of the shadow of death and violence. Now, every year as we approach Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I try to set aside a little bit of time to reread and to meditate upon portions of Dr. King's autobiography. If you have not read it, you should. It is wonderful. In recent years, almost every time the news has reported that yet another fanatical Muslim suicide bomber has killed innocent people, I am reminded particularly of one chapter in Dr. King's book. It is chapter 8, entitled The Violence of Desperate Men. Suicide bombers, unfortunately, include not only men, but also women and even children. And some of them, in fact, come from middle-class families. They are therefore not so much desperate as they seem to me, at least, to be deluded by their fundamentalistic extremism. Be that as it may, my sermon today to you is not about suicide bombers who I can never respect and for whom I have only condemnation. Today's message is about Dr. King and his followers, who were truly and personally desperate individuals, and yet who were people whom I hold in the highest esteem and for whom I have nothing but admiration. Well, why is that? It is because they were people of peace, who in the midst of oppression and at great risk to their own lives adhered with but a few exceptions to a policy of nonviolence. How difficult that was and how magnanimous they were, I think, can never be overstated. And so to illustrate that, I want to share a few things with you from Dr. King's 8th chapter. The year was 1956. Think back up on it if you remember it. The Supreme Court's Brown versus the Board of Education decision that public school segregation was unconstitutional at that point was only 2 years old. The Civil Rights Movement had barely begun, for it had only been on December the 1st, 1955, that Mrs. Rosa Parks had been arrested for refusing to move to the back of the bus. It had only been on the 5th of December that a meeting of ministers and civic leaders had unanimously elected King to be the president of what was then called the Montgomery Improvement Association. It was to lead the now famous bus boycott. Very much under the influence of Unitarian Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, Dr. King conceived of the civil rights movement as, quote, an act of massive non-cooperation. At that meeting, in what he then thought was the most decisive speech of my life, Dr. King sought to balance the group's demand for social justice with a very strong affirmation of the Christian doctrine of love. Let us be Christian in all of our actions, he told the audience. In his autobiography, he wrote this: that night we were starting a movement that would gain national recognition, whose echoes would ring in the ears of people of every nation, a movement that would astound the oppressor and bring new hope to the oppressed. And that movement would have as its key principle, he wrote, the policy of nonviolence. Now, organization was the very first order of business, and so Dr. King began to set up committees to give the movement guidance and direction. And since the police at that point were very strictly enforcing the taxi regulations, black cab drivers quickly had to stop giving cheap rides to blacks who were boycotting the buses. Soon, however, a volunteer force of hundreds of private cars and drivers were formed by King and his group to dispatch people, vehicles, and so forth as needed. More important, of course, was the very basic philosophy which guided the movement. In the first days of the protest, wrote Dr. King, the phrase most often heard was Christian love. It was the Sermon on the Mount that initially inspired the Negroes, this is King's language now, the Negroes of Montgomery to dignified social action. It was Jesus of Nazareth who stirred the Negroes to protest with the creative weapon of love. But very quickly, the inspiration of Mahatma Gandhi began to exert its own influence. Dr. King realized that the Christian doctrine of love, operating through the Gandhian method of nonviolence, was one of the most potent weapons available to the Negro in his struggle for freedom. So it was that nonviolence emerged as the technique of the movement, while love stood as its regulating ideal. Christ furnished the spirit and motivation, while Gandhi furnished the method. Now, most of Montgomery's blacks supported this approach. A few, however, favored violence. Like today's suicide bombers, some believed in what King refers to as aggressive violence. A member of Dr. King's own church solemnly suggested at one meeting, quote, that it would be to our advantage to kill off 8 or 10 white people. This, he said, is the only language these white folks will ever understand. If we fail to do this, he said, they will think that we are afraid. Others, on the other hand, advocated what Dr. King referred to as retaliatory violence, saying that, as one man put it, if nobody bothers me, I won't bother anybody, but if I am hit, I will hit back. Somehow, Dr. King convinced that group of two things. First of all, that nonviolence is not a strategy that one uses because it is expedient at the moment. And second, that nonviolence is ultimately a way of life that men and women live by because of the sheer morality of its claim. The Montgomery bus boycott was an immediate success in several ways, in ending black ridership, in cutting off a major source of city revenue, and in bringing city officials to the negotiating table. Black demands that were being made at that time were for courteous treatment on buses, for a first-come, first-served seating within the black and white zones, and for employment of black drivers on predominantly black routes. All of these things were reasonable, and not only that, they were within the present segregation laws. Nevertheless, city officials stubbornly resisted all such change. As tensions increased and tempers flared, Dr. King was tempted, he writes at one point, into giving into anger, to indignation, and to resentment. And yet he knew that, to quote him, this was no way to solve the problem. You must not harbor anger, he told himself. You must be willing to suffer the anger of the opponent and yet not return angry. You must not become bitter. No matter how emotional your opponents are, you must remain calm. Now, such equanimity became even more difficult as city officials resorted to spreading false rumors about Dr. King and other black leaders in an attempt to discredit them in the eyes of their followers. Soon, the city officials even adopted a get-tough policy that consisted of arresting blacks for minor and even imaginary traffic violations. Dr. King himself, for example, and there was a wonderful photo here of his mugshot. Dr. King himself was arrested and jailed and fingerprinted for doing 30 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone. Now, under fear of losing their licenses or having their insurance revoked so that they no longer could earn a living, many black drivers felt they had to drop out of the volunteer carpool. Now, all during this time, Dr. King and other black leaders were receiving dozens upon dozens of threatening phone calls and letters, and when some of those turned into death threats, Dr. King addressed an audience at a mass meeting and said this: "If one day you find me sprawled out dead, I do not want you to retaliate with a single act of violence. I urge you to continue protesting with the same dignity and discipline you have shown thus far." Well, push came to shove. On the night of January 30th, 1956, for then it was that Dr. King was put to the test to see if in fact he would practice what he had been preaching. He had gone to the First Baptist Church for a mass rally. His wife and child had remained at the parsonage. Now, during that meeting, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy came up to King and informed him that a bomb had exploded up on the porch of that house. And it was not yet known if anyone had been hurt. Dr. King wrote, "I accepted the word of the bombing calmly. I urged each person to go straight home after the meeting and to adhere strictly to our philosophy of nonviolence. I admonished them not to become panicky and lose their heads." Upon arriving at his house, Dr. King discovered that there were hundreds of people with angry faces gathered all around with the police futilely trying to disperse the crowd. One black man was yelling at an officer, "You got your 38 and I got mine, so let's battle it out now." And King realized from that and other things that many people present were armed, and that nonviolent resistance was on the verge of being transformed into terrible violence. Fortunately, the bomb had not hurt anyone. At that point, the mayor, the police commissioner, and several white reporters were inside the house. Now, their words expressed deep regret, but their pale faces expressed the fear that they had for their own personal safety, as the crowd outside seemed to be on the point of getting out of hand. It was at that point that Dr. King himself went out on the porch and asked the crowd to come to order. There was complete silence. He told them that no one had been hurt, and then he said this: "We believe in law and order. Don't get panicky. Don't do anything panicky at all. Don't get your weapons. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. We are not advocating violence. We want to love our enemies. I want you to love our enemies. Be good to them, love them, and let them know you love them." And as he finished speaking, there were shouts of "Amen" and "God bless you" from the crowd, and there were tears on many faces. Similarly, Dr. King said the following a little while later at another situation that arose. He said, "If we are arrested every day, if we are exploited every day, if we are trampled over every day, don't ever let anyone put you so low as to hate them. We must use the weapon of love. We must have compassion and understanding for those who hate us. We must realize that so many people are taught to hate us that they are not totally responsible for their hate. Even if we stand in life at midnight, we are always on the threshold of a new dawn," he said. That event made Dr. King think of the viciousness of some people who would bomb his home. He could feel the anger rising, he wrote in his autobiography, as he realized that his wife and baby could very easily have been killed. "I was," he wrote, "on the verge of corroding hatred. But I caught myself and I said to myself, you must not allow yourself to become bitter." And then just 2 nights later, a stick of dynamite was thrown on the lawn of another black home. No one was hurt. Once more, a large crowd of neighbors gathered, but they did not lose control. And so, wrote Dr. King in his autobiography, nonviolence had won its first and its second tests. These bombings made Dr. King at one point even consider the question of carrying a gun himself. And he and his wife talked about that for several days. And finally, they agreed that arms were no solution. "How could I serve as one of the leaders of a nonviolent movement," reasoned King, "and at the same time use weapons of violence for my own personal protection?" He understood that if he and the other black leaders had become distracted by the question of their own safety, then they would have lost the moral offensive and would have sunk to the level of their oppressors. In stark contrast to the mentality of fanatical suicide bombers and the violence of desperate men, Dr. King preached and Dr. King practiced a philosophy of nonviolence. He did this because he understood very well, as he said, along the way of life, someone must have sense enough and morality enough to cut off the chain of hate and of evil. And he believed that the greatest way to do that is through love. Love, he wrote, is a transforming power that can lift a whole community to new horizons of fair play, goodwill, and justice. Christians often refer to Jesus as the Prince of Peace. By following his example, Martin became the King of Peace, the prophet of freedom, and by his own sacrifice, the priest of civil rights for everyone in the United States. Let us never cease to honor this great man, and let us never forget the lesson he taught: violence is not the answer. Amen. Thank you very much.